Our third and last speaker for the session is Lewis Harrison. He earned his PhD from Louisiana State University in 1997 and an Academy Fellow since 2012. He is a professor at the University of Texas at Austin in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction in the College of Education, with additional dual appointments in the Center for African American Studies and the African American Diaspora Studies Department in the College of Liberal Arts. The title of his paper is The Miseducation of the African American Athlete. Please welcome Lewis Harrison.
Good morning. Had to check to make sure it was still morning. I'd like to thank Dr. Ennis for this opportunity to present to you today. She has been an inspiration in my work for more than she actually knows, so I'm glad to have this opportunity to say that publicly. One of the things that, well, let me just talk about the agenda today. I want to talk about the book. Many of you have heard of this book, The Miseducation of the Negro, that was written by Carter G. Woodson. And today I want to talk a little bit about the book, give you an introduction to my talk, address my theoretical framework, and look at three topics: the education, the miseducation, and what I call the re-education of the African American athlete. So when we look at this particular book, I had read it a long time ago, but recently I looked at it again, and it was amazing how the things that Woodson was saying in this book are, even though he wrote it in 1933, are applicable to a lot of things that we see today, particularly when we look at the African American athlete. Again, it was published in 1933, and the premise basically is that Negroes' education was antithetical to their being. And when we look at African American athletes now, again, not all athletes, but for a lot of student athletes, their education really is not helpful to them in attaining success in life, as one might define success. So what Woodson was saying then was that this education is really a miseducation. And I'm simply trying to look at the situation of the African American athlete through the lens of this particular book. This is a quote, and I'll have several quotes from the book that I think really address some of the situations with African American athletes. But this one is kind of an overriding quote that I think is very true today as it was when he wrote it. I'm not going to read these off to you. I'm going to insult your intelligence like that. But again, I think you'll agree with this particular quote. By way of introduction, one of the things we see with African American athletes is that they occupy a very peculiar place in our society. Again, African American males, and I'm mainly speaking of African American males, in society are often looked at with more than, might I say, a curiosity, but in some cases a disdain. But when you look at the African American athlete, it's very different. Okay, so they are a part of the revenue-generating machine of many universities, but in many cases, they don't actually take part in the revenue that they're generating, and in many cases, they're not even don't even have the opportunity to take advantage of the educational opportunities that are there. So again, they're at these bastions of research and places where all of this great knowledge is being generated. And unfortunately, in many cases, they are not part of that process, although they receive a scholarship. Many times they're not availed to the scholarly resources that are on those campuses. So who's to blame for this? Who's to blame? Many would blame the African American athletes themselves because, again, this is what they signed up for, right? Others will blame the universities and say they're simply taking advantage of these athletes. But I would like to take it a step further and say that these athletes are really being miseducated. And I'll explain that as I go forth. Before going into that, I want to talk a little bit about the framework, the theoretical framework that I use, and it's called critical race theory. Those of you in education may be familiar with that. It's one that's used quite often in other areas of education. And it is creeping into physical education and kinesiology now. But this theory kind of critiques and dismantles the injustice of society by looking at the persistence of inequality, or in some cases racism, in society, and looking at this in terms of the fact that a lot of the inequality is really based on race, although a lot of people don't like to deal with that particular area. And I'm not apologizing, but I also realize that a lot of the things I'm talking about today may make some people a little bit uncomfortable, but I'm used to that. So this theory kind of challenges this idea of the universality of the white experience, of the judgment of white people as the authoritative standard for knowledge. So it really challenges and takes a look at those things, and we'll look at some of the tenets of this theory. There are 5 basic tenets of critical race theory. The first being counter storytelling. It allows those that are being researched to tell their story. Again, we're talking about African American athletes. We look at it through the lenses of people who are marginalized quite often. And it allows that story to be told. It also assumes that there is an endurance of racism. I know I was watching television the other day, and there was a lady said that racism didn't start until Obama became president. But critical race theory makes the assumption that there is an endurance of racism. It also talks about whiteness as property. And basically it's talking about privilege there, but whiteness is the property of those who are white, and those who are not don't have that particular property. Okay? It also looks at interest convergence, that the changes that occur in our society that positively affect minorities only come about when they are aligned with the desires of the dominant culture. Okay? So there must be an interest convergence for change to take place. And one of the best examples of that, and you talk about the Brown decision where the schools were integrated, that occurred not necessarily to the advantage of African American kids, but more so for whites, because many of the African American teachers, administrators, coaches lost their jobs in the integration process. Okay? It also critiques liberalism, or this idea of color blindness, that the law and society are all fair and nobody observes color. Okay? So these are the tenets of this particular theory, and that's kind of the lens through which I look at a lot of my work. Again, another quote from Woodson. We talk about the education of the African American athlete. Woodson says that, and he's talking about Negroes, as he calls them then, that graduate actually throw away opportunities pursuing something that they will never achieve. And again, to me, that is so obviously the case for many African American athletes. They are pursuing roles in professional sport that, if you simply look at the numbers, 98% of them will never achieve. But at the same time, they often don't take advantage of the educational opportunities that are right there. So when we look at this education, African American athletes, again, are educated. And again, we're not talking about the formal education, but they are educated through sports socialization. Some time back, Susan Greendorfer talked about the fact that African American and white researchers are socialized into sport in very different ways. And interestingly, she talked about the outside influences of those kids pushing them toward sport, okay? Coaches, friends, teachers, a lot of people outside the family. Now, Harris and Smith, who's a graduate student of mine that just finished his dissertation last year, basically saw the same thing, that there are a lot of outside influences pushing black kids toward sport. And in Smith's dissertation, he noted that the family were the only people that exerted any kind of positive academic influence on those individuals. And he kind of illustrated it with the scales and how unbalanced they were, that the parents were the only one talking about academics. Everybody else was talking about athletic performance. But then there has been some research that looks at the black family's influence on sport. Crystal Beeman, who is also in Texas, not at the University of Texas, but she talked about there was a familial influence in sport for African American athletes that were in college. Now again, the previous researchers talked about middle school and school-age kids, but Beeman spoke specifically about college athletes, that there was a family influence at that point. Okay, so again, that's interesting, and that's some areas that we probably need to look into a little more closely. Another area is athletic identity, an area that I love to study because it's such an interesting aspect of an athlete. And it's simply the strength of identification with the athletic role, how strongly one feels about themselves in terms of being an athlete. And it has been linked to racial identity development also. So there's this intermingling of athletic identity development and racial identity development that I believe has an impact and kind of pushes more African American students into that athletic role. What I found not long ago was athletes on the same team, under the same coaches, the African American athletes had a much stronger athletic identity than their white peers. So again, they identified with that athletic role much more strongly than their peers, even though they were under all of the same environmental influences. We find, though, that athletic identity does have positive impact. Okay, it's been linked to increased performance. So it does work. Unfortunately, though, there are some negative side effects that occur with it, and it can lead to what's called role engulfment. Adler calls it, again, role engulfment, where they only see sport as something that they are. They don't see themselves in any other roles, even though they occupy a lot of other roles. Sport has typically engulfed their lives. And you can see that any of you here that have been around student athletes can see how it's very easy to be engulfed in that athletic role. Also, there's been some work on what's called, others have called it basically the same thing, but they're talking about identity foreclosure, where they foreclose on the athletic role as their only identity, rather than having other identities. Most of us have multiple identities. This identity foreclosure, where they just kind of cut out most of the other identities that they may develop in life, focusing mainly on that athletic role. We find, though, is that student athletes that have multiple identities tend to fare better both academically and socially and in their transition out of the athletic role, okay? And that's one of my big concerns, is that we don't focus on the transition out. I mean, as an athlete, you're only going to be there for a limited time. I don't care how good you are, you're not going to be 50 and 60 and still be a professional athlete. So you have to transition out, and quite often we don't look at how these athletes transition out of that role. But having multiple identities tends to aid that transition. So this is kind of a little diagram that I've come up with, and look at all the influences, and we obviously don't have time to go through all of those today, but all the different influences that kind of push or kind of influence or mold African American kids into this athletic role and make them feel that they are going to be professional athletes. All right. Also, when you look at African American athletes and you recognize, again, the peculiar position they are in, when they're in society, they're often looked at suspiciously. But when they're on the field, this is the kind of reaction they get from people. Now, this photograph is something I picked up off the web, but it was just so powerful to me in terms of, and this is nothing against my friends and colleagues at Auburn. This could happen at any university. But it just happened to capture what we're talking about. I mean, look at the fans and look at the student athlete. And where else can a black young person get that kind of response from a large number of white people? Again, I just found it to be a very, very powerful statement about why black athletes develop this strong athletic identity. This is the only place that's probably going to happen. Okay? Now, I want to show you again what happens sometimes when the athlete, that athletic identity is taken from them, especially taken from them very abruptly. If any of you have, the clip was from Friday Night Lights. If any of you have watched that movie, there is a scene where one of the main characters, Boobie Miles, who's the running back, black high school running back, extremely talented young man, was doing really well. He gets injured, okay? I've forgotten exactly what the injury was. It was to his knee. He tried to rehab, came back, knee just wouldn't hold up, okay? And there's a scene where he goes into the locker room and he's going to retrieve his stuff from the locker room, and all the other athletes are in there and they're talking, and he's trying to maintain this air of machismo. But when he walks out and he gets in the car with his uncle, he cries like a baby. And he tells his uncle, "What else am I going to do? That's all I know how to do." His uncle had told him they were going to the pros and all of this, and he said, "What am I going to do now? That's all I'm going to do." And that is such a powerful scene. If any of you have seen that, it's a very powerful scene, but it's one that I have seen to some degree or another several times in my career. Okay? When I was at LSU, I knew a young man that kind of went through the same thing. Went into, I don't know if he actually went to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but he really went into a depression and just didn't want to do anything after that. I have a young man just this past year when he finished his basketball career. And he had been in my class where I actually talked about this. And he came to me and he said, "I see it now. I know what you were talking about in class." He said, it hurts that his identity was taken away, that he realized he wasn't going to play professional basketball, even though that's what he had prepared for such a large portion of his life. So this idea of athletic identity, to me, is extremely compelling and something that I think we need to understand, but also something I think we need to work to try to find ways to make that transition a lot smoother. Now, I want to talk about the miseducation here. And again, this, I know I usually tell my students, don't put too much text on a slide. And I broke my own rule, but I just felt I needed to get this whole quote on here because it points out, to me, a great example of miseducation. And again, it's a man that is interviewing a professor at a black college, at a Negro college, and asking him, and he's saying, we don't offer any courses on Negro history, literature, or race. You say, we just study the Negro along with everybody else. And the interviewer said, well, that's an excellent idea. So no one should expect you to, but how do you do it when they're not mentioned in your text? And he said, no, we bring the Negro in here and there. And then said, well, how often is here and there? He said, well, Negroes haven't done that much anyway. So, we can just briefly cover it by the achievements of a few people. And unfortunately for a lot of African American athletes, they have no idea of the rich history of African American athletes in this country. And I would probably, and to be honest with you, I didn't know this until I started studying it, the rich and storied history of a lot of African American athletes of the past. And the fact that early African American athletes were not just athletes, they were scholars first. Okay? There are lots of I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, lots of African American athletes that whose history has just kind of been lost unless you go in looking for it. Fortunately, my colleague who is where's David? He's in the back. David does a great job of chronicling the biographies of a lot of African American athletes, kind of showing the multidimensionality of these athletes. They weren't just athletes. They weren't, as one of my students call it, the flattening of the African American athlete to see them as one-dimensional. And if I might share a humorous story with you, I had a graduate student a few years back who was studying this with me, and he, like myself, was intrigued by a lot of the work that David had done. And for some reason, I guess he pulled David's picture up. And I was coming in one morning and he met me and he said, Doc. I said, what? He said, David Wiggins is white. I said, yeah, I know. He said, but he's white. He just didn't understand how a white person would do so much great work on African American history. But again, it was part of his education. He was miseducated in that he thought that the only people that did this kind of work were black people. Okay, so but David and others do a lot of great work in chronicling the lives of many African American athletes. I had the privilege of, when I was at LSU, interviewing a man who was the first black player at LSU. And after I moved to Texas, I had a grad student that actually got to talk to his son. So we got a chance to look at that historical piece through his eyes and through his sons who came to play after him. And there's such a rich story there, was that this man, Collis Temple, father had been excluded from LSU, wanted to go to grad school at LSU, but was not allowed to do so. But then it's the same school that had to come and sit in his living room and talk to his son about coming to LSU and playing basketball. But not only did Collis' sons not only did Collis play, he had two sons that actually played for LSU. And one of them, I think, whose story is totally under-recognized, got his bachelor's degree, got his master's degree, and was working on a PhD before he finished his eligibility. So again, stories that get buried sometimes that I think present-day African-American athletes could really do well to know and understand. Also, David and others trouble this historic notion of the natural athlete or this athletic superiority by black athletes also. Other colleagues have looked at stereotyping and the self-stereotyping of black athletes in terms of their ideas of what their abilities simply because of their skin color. Also, we look at the hidden curriculum, and this is another quote from Woodson. He says, the Negro had no place in the curriculum. He's pictured as being a human being, one of lower order, unable to subject passion or reason, to simply be used as a hewer of wood and a drawer of water. In other words, just cheap labor. Okay? And we kind of see that again in the sporting context. The hidden curriculum, most of us who in pedagogy know from David Kirk, talks about this invisible and forces, again, that occur in educational spaces that are not part of the formal curriculum, but they're very powerful in the way they operate. So Singer did a study when he looked at black student athletes, and he said that they didn't like to be called student athletes. He said they liked to be called athlete students because that was a more accurate depiction of what they had to do. When we look at FBS schools, again, part of the hidden curriculum, when you look at the difference in the percentage of African-American students in the school versus the percentage of African-American athletes in the revenue-producing sports. And there's a big disconnect there. Again, part of that miseducation in the hidden curriculum, NCAA procedures, again, they project those through colorblind lens, and Albert Bimper and I had a chance to look at universities' mission statements, and again, see the color blindness that is there. The influence of media, obviously, is a part of that miseducation, and Lowen calls the heroification of black athletes, that they're depicted as heroes, thus young children want to aspire to do that. And also they're looked at as there are some that are embraceable, but some that are unembraceable. And I'm sure everybody's aware of Colin Kaepernick and his issues in sport. So these embraceable athletes are generally silent, don't talk about social issues. The unembraceable athletes are villainized because they don't conform to the norm. And basically, I've seen this. Sometimes when you read the stories about that, I like to go to the comments afterwards. And quite often, I see this comment that these athletes need to just shut up and play ball. Don't be human beings. Don't have feelings. Shut up and play ball. So that, again, there's a need for re-education, to understand the African-American athlete, the whole African-American athlete, the personal, the social, emotional issues. Use a framework of culturally relevant pedagogy in terms of educating these athletes and allowing them to learn based on their needs and allowing them to be proud of their own culture. And one of the things Albert Bimper and I found, again, we looked at successful student athletes, those who were successful athletically and academically. What we found is that they valued education as a tool for liberation. They sought refuge in communities that contributed to their success, both academically and athletically. And they had complex identities. They weren't just athletes. They were complex individuals. And those were the individuals that did well, both athletically and academically. And I want to thank my co-authors, Albert Bemper, who is now an assistant professor at the University of Colorado State University, former student athlete. Martin Smith played at Cal basketball. He is now assistant professor at Duke University. And Alvin Logan, who is presently working on his dissertation, played football at Washington University. In case anybody's looking for an employee, Alvin's going to be up pretty soon. Okay, thank you.